My mom sent me a voicemail. "You're out of the family business." I didn't beg, I didn't argue, I simply replied, "Understood." And then, in complete silence, I quietly sold my 40% stake, letting the transaction speak louder than any argument ever could, and exactly 48 hours later, my phone lit up with 72 missed calls from my brother. They were panicking, but by then, I had already chosen the path they never saw coming. It's strange, isn't it, how the quietest moments in life can end up carrying the loudest echoes, how a few cold, clipped words left in a voicemail can unravel decades of sacrifice, loyalty, and silent hopes you've carefully woven into something you thought was unbreakable, something you believed was called family, only to realize, sitting there in the silence of your own apartment, that perhaps it was never really about family at all. Perhaps it was always about power, control, and legacy, and there had never been space for someone like me, a man who preferred spreadsheets over speeches, who showed up every day not with grand visions but with quiet persistence, making sure the lights stayed on while others chased the spotlight. For years, I told myself that being the reliable one, the steady one, the one who fixed things behind the scenes without expecting credit or fanfare would, in time, earn me a seat at their table, that one day they would look at me and finally see the son, the brother, the partner who had kept them afloat more times than they would ever admit. But that belief, that hope, shattered in an instant the moment I heard my mother's voice, devoid of warmth, stripped of affection, speaking not as a mother, but as a corporate executive delivering a termination notice. And as I sat in the hush of my apartment, where even the hum of the refrigerator sounded louder than her words, I realized that my silence wasn't weakness, it had always been my shield, and in that moment, I saw that it could also become my sword, a weapon forged not in anger or spite but in clarity and resolve. I didn't call them back. I didn't send angry emails or show up demanding explanations they would only twist into justifications. I simply said, "Understood." And in the quiet that followed, I took the action they never expected. I sold my 40% stake, cleanly, quietly, without fanfare, without spectacle, because I understood now that I never needed their approval to make moves that protected my future. And when, 48 hours later, the panic set in and the calls flooded my phone, not with apologies but with chaos and desperation, I let the phone ring, because this was no longer my storm to fix, no longer my burden to carry. But this story isn't just about business or revenge, it's about the quiet power of knowing when to walk away, about the courage it takes to set boundaries even with the people you once believed would never cross them, and about how, sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting harder to stay in a room that no longer respects you, but standing up, walking out, and letting your silence do the talking. And today, I want to take you through that journey with me, because if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or undervalued, whether in your family, your workplace, or your life, this story might just remind you that your worth was never tied to the seat they offered you at their table. It's been within you all along, waiting for the moment you finally decide to claim it. You see, what they never truly understood, what they never wanted to understand, was that long before that voicemail, long before the clipped words that cut like a corporate memo disguised as family conversation, I had been bleeding for that business in ways they never noticed or cared to notice, because to them, I was always just the quiet one, the fixer, the background guy, the dependable one who never asked for credit, never demanded recognition, and perhaps that was my biggest mistake. Believing that love and loyalty were currencies that would one day be returned in kind, when in reality, they were debts they never intended to pay. When the markets crashed and their impulsive spending left the company teetering on the edge of insolvency, it was me who cashed out the tiny investments I had scraped together from summer jobs in high school, quietly transferring the money into the company's account to cover payroll, making sure the employees, the people they called family, during company Christmas parties, got their checks on time while my own rent went unpaid for a month. When they overspent on the flashy, unnecessary equipment they insisted would make the company future-proof, the same equipment that now sat collecting dust in the warehouse, I was the one who deferred buying my first car, choosing instead to redirect every penny into emergency supplier payments so the production line wouldn't stall. But of course, when the crisis passed, they were the ones taking the credit, patting themselves on the back for their vision. while I was quietly labeled the bean counter who just didn't understand the big picture. It became a pattern, an endless, exhausting cycle where I played the role of the invisible safety net, absorbing every mistake, every miscalculation, every financial storm they had recklessly sailed us into, not because I loved the business itself, though I did, in a way, but because I clung to the hope that my sacrifices would eventually earn me a place at their table, that they would finally look at me and say, "We see you, we value you, we couldn't have done this without you." But that day never came, and deep down, perhaps I always knew it wouldn't, because every family dinner where business was discussed, I found myself sidelined, physically excluded from the huddles where decisions were made, only to be called in after the fact to work the numbers, to fix the chaos they had created without once being given the dignity of being part of the creation process itself. Looking back now, I see how clear the signs were, how obvious the writing on the wall had been, and yet I chose to look away, to believe that blood ties would somehow override the glaring patterns of disregard and dismissal, that my place in the family would always secure my place in the business. But the truth was, I was never more than a convenient fallback. A safety net they could pull tight when the storms hit, and then roll back into the shadows when the skies cleared. And perhaps the hardest part of all is realizing that I allowed it, that I made myself small, that I accepted the scraps of validation they threw my way, believing they were enough, when all along, I should have been building my own table, setting my own place, and understanding that no amount of sacrifice would ever make people who refused to see you suddenly open their eyes. But it took a voicemail to make me see that. It took their cold, clipped words to finally shatter the illusion I had been clinging to for far too long. And once the illusion was broken, there was no going back. And yet, as much as that voicemail felt like a betrayal sharp enough to sever flesh from bone, what came next cut even deeper, because while the voicemail was at least direct, cold, yes, but straightforward, the next wound came dressed in the false familiarity of social media, that place where people curate their lives into highlight reels, where appearances matter more than truths, and where I, the ever-diligent, ever-responsible son, discovered that not only had they cut me out, but they had done so long before the voicemail ever arrived. It happened, of all things, on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those ordinary, gray-skied days where the world feels suspended in a kind of bland stillness, the kind of day where you scroll through your feed not out of curiosity but habit, letting the endless stream of vacation selfies, engagement announcements, and birthday cakes numb you into temporary distraction, until suddenly, there it was, a post from a local business group. A photo that slapped me awake with all the subtlety of an unexpected funeral notice. There they were, my mother and my brother, standing in front of the company logo, beaming, handshakes frozen mid-grip with a man I had never seen before, a caption announcing a major new partnership that would propel the company into a bold new era of growth and innovation. A post flooded with congratulatory comments from peers, clients, even distant relatives, all cheering on this visionary step forward, while I, the 40% stakeholder, sat in my apartment, learning about it alongside strangers. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, the air thickening around me like invisible concrete, the words on the screen blurring into a smear of betrayal, because this wasn't just a business decision made without me, this was a calculated, deliberate erasure of my existence, a public rewriting of the company's narrative where I, the one who had kept the books balanced, the doors open, the payrolls met, didn't even warrant a footnote. And when I called my mother, because of course I called, still clinging, even then, to the absurd hope that perhaps it was a mistake, an oversight, a miscommunication, she brushed it off with the same airy condescension that had defined every interaction between us for as long as I could remember, telling me, "Oh, that, yes, we meant to tell you, but it all happened so fast." As if multimillion-dollar partnerships are spontaneous things, as if my 40% ownership could be so easily swept aside. With a smile and a sigh. But it was Mark, my brother, who delivered the final, unforgivable blow, his voice dripping with that casual arrogance he had always worn like cologne, telling me, "Yeah, man, you're just the money guy, let us handle the real decisions." And in that moment, something inside me broke, not in a way that sparks rage or screams or demands for justice, but in that cold, clean way where you finally see the truth for what it is, stripped of all its comforting lies and excuses. Because they hadn't just left me out of a deal. They had left me out of the family. And perhaps they always had. That phone call, that cold, clipped conversation with my mother and brother, should have been the moment I fought back, the point in the story where the wronged son lashes out, demands his place at the table, throws their own hypocrisy in their faces, but instead, it became the conversation that sealed everything I had quietly suspected but never dared to admit aloud, because in those few, dispassionate sentences, they proved me right in ways more brutal than I could have imagined. As I sat there, the phone pressed against my ear, listening to my mother's carefully rehearsed explanations, her tone wrapped in that condescending kindness she reserved for me, like I was a child who simply didn't understand the complexities of grown-up business decisions. I realized she wasn't trying to explain or apologize. She was trying to diminish, to erase, to reframe my existence from a stakeholder to a side note, a necessary annoyance in the narrative they had crafted where Mark was the golden child, the face of the company, the future, while I was, at best, the human calculator who should know his place and stay quiet when the real conversations happened. And Mark, oh Mark, he didn't even bother with the pretense of kindness. His words came slick, polished, laced with the smug certainty of someone who had spent his life being told he was destined for greatness, brushing me aside with that casual smirk I could hear even over the phone as he said, "Relax, man, you're just a money guy, you wouldn't get it anyway." And in those words, in that dismissive laugh, I finally understood the role they had written for me all along, the one I had blindly accepted for years, the one that allowed them to take my efforts, my sacrifices, my silent contributions and repackage them as footnotes in their success story. And maybe once upon a time, I would have argued, would have pleaded for them to see me, to hear me, to value me, but not this time, not anymore. Because as I sat there in the growing darkness of my apartment, the only light coming from the dull glow of the phone screen, I realized I didn't need to fight them on their terms, in their arena, using their rules, because they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the very thing they had spent years mocking me for, my understanding of the numbers, the contracts, the structure of the business they believed they controlled simply because they carried the louder voices. And so I ended the call not with threats or ultimatums, but with silence, a silence that spoke louder than any argument I could have made, because I knew, in that moment, that they had handed me the only weapon I needed, their arrogance, their overconfidence, their belief that I would always play the role they assigned me, and I intended to use it not to beg them to let me back in, but to walk away on my own terms, quietly, deliberately, and in a way they would never see coming. Because sometimes the most devastating moves don't come with screaming matches or slammed doors. Sometimes they come with nothing but a steady hand, a quiet nod, and a signature on a set of papers that changes everything. And that's exactly what I was about to do. In the past, I might have answered those 72 calls, I might have given in to the flood of guilt, the desperate pleas, the manipulative undertones woven into every voicemail Mark left. His voice flipping back and forth between anger and panic, trying to regain the upper hand by pulling the same emotional levers they had always used to keep me in line, but not this time, not anymore, because that version of me, the one who still believed they would change if I just explained harder, sacrificed more, proved myself louder, had finally died the moment I heard my mother's voice stripped of humanity, delivering my exile from the family business as if she were dismissing an underperforming employee, and in its place rose someone they didn't recognize, someone they had never cared to see, a man who had spent years quietly mastering the very systems they thought they controlled, who understood the contracts, the financials, the bylaws, the loopholes, and now, finally, was prepared to use them. I didn't answer their calls, I didn't storm into family meetings demanding to be heard, I didn't write emotional emails or beg them to reconsider, because I understood something they never would. Real power doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to demand attention, it doesn't need to posture in front of boardrooms or family dinners. Real power moves in silence, behind closed doors, with precise documentation and airtight contracts, and that's exactly where I took the battle they started. turning to the one weapon they had always mocked me for possessing, my meticulous, relentless understanding of the numbers. The next day, while they were still calling, still scrambling, still assuming I would eventually break and crawl back asking for forgiveness, I was sitting in the office of a lawyer they didn't know I had kept in my corner for years, a sharp, strategic business attorney whose reputation for handling family business disputes was only rivaled by his discretion, and as I laid out the facts, the voicemail. The sudden deal announced on social media without my knowledge, the years of financial records I had kept, documenting every bailout, every loan, every transfer they never officially recorded but had quietly accepted. His interest sharpened, his eyes narrowing not in surprise but in recognition, because he had seen this pattern before, the same story playing out in countless family-run companies where the quiet child, the overlooked sibling, the underestimated partner, finally decided they were done playing the fool. "Documentation changes everything, Alex," he told me, his tone calm but certain, and I understood, in that moment, that I had been holding the key all along. I just hadn't been ready to turn it until now. Over the next few days, I became a machine, methodical, disciplined, emotionless, digging through old emails, bank statements, filing cabinets filled with faded invoices and handwritten notes, constructing a timeline so airtight even my brother's silver tongue wouldn't be able to spin it, laying out a narrative not built on emotion but on facts, on numbers, on their own signatures, their own patterns of mismanagement and financial dependence on the very person they had now discarded. And as the picture came into focus, I realized that the cracks in the company's financial foundation were deeper, wider, and more dangerous than even I had suspected. This wasn't just a story of incompetence or arrogance. It was a ticking time bomb of hidden debts, misappropriated funds, and backdoor deals they had scrambled to cover up for years, using my blind loyalty and willingness to bail them out as the bandages they needed to keep the facade intact. But the facade was crumbling, and they didn't even know it yet. With my documentation compiled, verified, and weaponized, the next move was simple in theory but devastating in execution. Rather than engage in a messy, emotional legal battle where they would surely try to drown me in family guilt and public humiliation, I followed my lawyer's guidance and quietly brokered a deal with a private equity firm known for acquiring stakes in messy, privately held companies, especially those poisoned by family dysfunction and financial mismanagement. And when I presented them with the clean, brutal facts, my 40% ownership, the undisclosed deal they had made behind my back, the financial holes I had plugged with my own money, the questionable practices they had buried in the books, they didn't blink. They saw the same thing I did, an opportunity. The due diligence process was swift, ruthless, more thorough than any audit my family had ever performed on themselves, and by the time the deal closed, signed in a quiet, sterile conference room without a single word of protest from me, I had effectively removed myself from the battlefield they believed they controlled, while simultaneously handing the keys of chaos to people who operated with no sentimental attachments. No family loyalties, only cold, hard business logic. And the best part? They still hadn't seen it coming. Because while they were still waiting for me to show up, angry and defeated, to beg for my seat back at the table, I was already gone, and the table itself was now surrounded by strangers they would have to answer to. There's a peculiar kind of stillness that follows a decision as final as the one I had made, a silence that doesn't hum with peace but crackles with unspoken tension, like the air before a storm, thick, heavy, electric with anticipation. And in those first 48 hours after the sale of my 40% stake was finalized, that silence became my closest companion, because while they still didn't know what I had done, I knew the dominoes were already falling, and all I had to do was wait for the noise to find them. I went about my life as if nothing had happened, brewing coffee in the same chipped mug, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, answering emails unrelated to the family business, forcing myself to focus on anything but the ticking clock I could feel in my chest, because even though I had played my move with the precision of a surgeon, the human part of me, the part that had spent years entangled in their chaos, conditioned to react, to fix, to clean up the messes they left behind, still itched to reach for the phone, to respond to the first wave of missed calls that started trickling in. But I didn't, I wouldn't, Because I understood now that this was no longer my storm to navigate. They had made their bed. It was time they learned how to lie in it without me. The first calls came from Mark, of course, his number lighting up my screen like clockwork, his voicemails oscillating between condescension and confusion, the same arrogant tone I had heard all my life now tinged with the faintest trace of uncertainty, as if he could sense the ground beneath him shifting, though he couldn't yet see the cracked spiderwebbing under his feet, and with each unanswered call, his messages grew more frantic. More aggressive, laced with veiled threats, desperate. Bargaining, thinly disguised as demands, as if he still believed he could bully me back into my place with the same tactics that had always worked before. But they didn't work. Not anymore. And the longer I stayed silent, the louder his panic became, because nothing unsettles the arrogant more than silence. Nothing shakes the powerful more than realizing the one they dismissed as insignificant is no longer reacting on cue. And as I sat in my apartment, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on my wall, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the years I had spent shouldering their failures, their egos, their reckless decisions, and in that quiet, I didn't feel regret or satisfaction, at least not yet. What I felt was release, the slow, aching unraveling of a burden I had carried for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The storm I had unleashed moved quickly, faster than even I anticipated. By the second day, the calls weren't just coming from Mark but from the company's general line, from my mother's personal assistant, from lawyers, from numbers I didn't recognize, all piling into my voicemail, the screen flashing with missed calls, texts, emails, the once silent void now filled with the sound of their world collapsing around them, and still, I didn't answer, I didn't respond, I didn't break. Because I knew that every unanswered call was a mirror, reflecting back to them the emptiness they had created, the absence they had demanded, and now, they were left to face it alone. I imagined the boardroom, the one they had once locked me out of, now filled with frantic meetings, panicked voices, desperate attempts to understand what had happened, why the new partner was suddenly freezing accounts, demanding audits, combing through years of financial records that no longer made sense without the silent glue I had always provided, and I pictured Mark, pacing, shouting, blaming, spinning stories no one believed anymore. Because the numbers didn't lie, and neither did my silence. And perhaps that was the most satisfying part of all, that I didn't have to lift a finger, didn't have to say a word, because the work was already done, the trap was already sprung, and now, all that was left for me to do was to watch, from the sidelines they had banished me to, as the empire they had built on lies, arrogance, and my sacrifices crumbled under the weight of their own deceit. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to intervene, to rescue, to clean up their mess. I let the storm rage, let the chaos consume them, let the silence do what I never could with words, force them to sit in the ruins of their own making. And as I turned off my phone, letting the calls roll straight to voicemail, I understood something I wished I had learned years ago. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all, to let the silence speak louder than any argument, any explanation, any plea for justice. Because the truth is, they weren't just panicking over the business falling apart. They were panicking because, for the first time, they realized they had lost control of me. And they would never get it back. By the end of the second day, the panic in their voices had transformed from irritation laced with superiority into something raw, frantic, and unmistakably desperate, because when people who are used to controlling the narrative suddenly lose their grip, they don't crumble with dignity, they unravel in chaos. Mark, my brother, the man who had once dismissed me as the bean counter, the numbers guy, the necessary evil in the backdrop of his carefully curated leadership image, was now calling me nonstop, his voicemails escalating from passive-aggressive jabs to outright begging, the thin veneer of confidence stripped away, revealing the scared, entitled child underneath. "Alex, what the hell did you do? Alex, you need to answer the damn phone. Alex, you don't understand what you've done to the company, to Mom, to all of us." And finally, "Please, Alex, just talk to me, we can fix this, we can undo this." But we couldn't. Because what he still couldn't grasp, even as his world collapsed around him, was that this wasn't just about the business anymore, wasn't just about contracts and ownership percentages. This was about boundaries, about respect, about finally forcing them to see that the person they had spent years ignoring, sidelining, belittling, wasn't the one who needed to fix anything anymore. Because I had already fixed the only thing that truly mattered, my own willingness to keep playing the role they had assigned me. And as I sat there, listening to his voicemails pile up, each one more frantic than the last, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel satisfaction, not in the way I once imagined I would if this moment ever came. Instead, I felt something deeper, heavier, almost bittersweet, because even now, even in the face of their collapse, a part of me mourned the fact that it had to come to this. That they had pushed me so far that the only way to protect myself was to burn the bridge they kept insisting I should be grateful to even stand on. I didn't respond immediately. I let them stew in the uncertainty, let them feel the discomfort of not knowing, the way they had forced me to live for years, excluded from decisions that affected my life, my future, my identity, because now, finally, the tables had turned, and they were the ones locked out of the room, banging on the door, begging to be let in. And when I finally answered, not because I owed them an explanation, but because I wanted them to hear the calm in my voice, the steel in my silence, I spoke with the same deliberate stillness they had once used to dismiss me. "What did I do?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the air, letting Mark sit in the weight of his own question before continuing, my tone even, detached, surgical. "I sold my 40% stake, Mark. To an investor. They're the new partner now. They're the ones asking the questions you never thought would be asked." His silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know, the bravado crumbling under the realization that for once, he wasn't the smartest guy in the room, that the deal he and Mom had tried to push through behind my back was now under the scrutiny of people who didn't care about our family name, didn't care about his charm, didn't care about the carefully spun stories he had fed to clients and in stores for years. "They're freezing accounts," he finally blurted, his voice cracking, the mask of the golden boy shattering into pieces. "They're going through everything. They said there are problems, Alex. You need to fix this. You have to undo it." But I didn't have to do anything. Because I wasn't the fixer anymore. "I took you at your word, Mark," I said, each word a quiet, deliberate strike, using his own phrases, his own dismissiveness, against him. "You said I was just the money guy. You said you didn't need me involved. You made it very clear. I'm out, remember? This is your show now. Enjoy it." And before he could sputter another excuse, another plea, another thinly veiled threat, I hung up, letting the silence speak louder than anything else I could have said, because for the first time in my life, I understood that walking away wasn't weakness. It was the strongest move I had ever made. And the irony was, the very thing they had feared most wasn't losing the business, it was losing control of me. And they had already lost. In the days that followed, the consequences of my decision unfolded faster and more violently than even I had anticipated, because the investor, the one I had quietly brought into the fold, didn't waste time playing nice or extending courtesy calls. They moved with the ruthless precision of a team that had seen this story play out 100 times before, freezing accounts, halting operations, demanding full financial transparency, and what they found buried in the books didn't just confirm my suspicions, it exposed an entire web of mismanagement, deception, and cover-ups that had been festering for years under the glossy facade my mother and Mark had so carefully maintained. The audits were relentless, the forensic accountants unflinching, combing through every transaction, every off-the-book loan, every whispered deal my family had struck in the shadows to keep the company afloat without ever acknowledging the debts they were quietly accumulating behind closed doors, and as the reports piled up, so did the evidence that the business they claimed was thriving had, in truth, been rotting from the inside out, propped up only by my years of silent bailouts and their desperate need to project success at any cost. It turned out the partnership deal they had celebrated so publicly, the one they had used as their victory lap to showcase their brilliance to the world, was nothing more than a last-ditch attempt to plug a hole they had dug themselves into, a hole so deep that without my silent financial transfusions over the years, the company would have collapsed long ago. And now, with the investors' team scrutinizing every corner of the operation. That hole was no longer theirs to hide. Legal actions loomed on the horizon, lawsuits from suppliers, creditors, and former employees who had been left in the dark as my mother and Mark funneled resources into vanity projects and debt-juggling schemes, and the whispers that once lived in the shadows of the industry now grew into loud, damning headlines, painting the family business not as a legacy of success but as a cautionary tale of greed, arrogance, and familial dysfunction. I watched it all unfold from a distance, not with glee or vindication, but with a quiet, somber acceptance, because while a part of me had hoped they might finally confront their failures with humility, I knew better. People like them don't change when faced with the truth. They double down, they blame, they rewrite the narrative to cast themselves as the victims, and that's exactly what they did. Spinning stories to anyone who would listen about how I had betrayed the family, how I had sold them out, conveniently ignoring the years I had kept them afloat, while they burned through resources like children playing with matches in a dry field. But the difference now was that their words no longer mattered to me, their opinion no longer held weight, because I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that no amount of sacrifice, no mountain of evidence, no carefully crafted argument would ever make people see you differently if they had already decided who you were in their story, and that their story no longer had any place in mine. What I hadn't expected, though, was the ripple effect outside the family, the colleagues, the employees, the clients who had once smiled politely at me in meetings, who had heard the whispers but never dared to speak them aloud, now coming forward, quietly, hesitantly, some offering support, others offering apologies, but all of them confirming what I had known all along, that the business had been a sinking ship, and that they, too, had been complicit in pretending it wasn't, because confronting the truth is always more uncomfortable than ignoring it. And perhaps that was the most bitter truth of all, that I had spent years clinging to the belief that if I just worked harder, sacrificed more, proved myself over and over again, I could change the course of a story that had been written long before I was old enough to understand the script. But now, as the dust settled and the lawsuits stacked up, as the headlines faded and the company they had weaponized against me dissolved into court filings and creditor meetings, I realized that the real victory wasn't in watching them fall. It was in knowing I had finally walked away, that I had chosen myself over a family that never chose me, that I had, at last, put down the burden they had convinced me was mine to carry alone. And in that there was peace. In the weeks that followed, as the legal battles raged on and the company my grandfather had built slowly unraveled under the weight of my mother and Mark's mismanagement, I found myself facing a different kind of reckoning, one far quieter but no less consuming, because while the business might have been lost, what I hadn't prepared for was the aching void it left behind, the hollow space where the idea of family used to live, now stripped bare, exposed as the fragile illusion it had always been. For years, I had wrapped my identity in that business, had allowed it to define my worth, to dictate my choices, to tether me to people who never saw me as more than a convenient fixture in their carefully controlled world. And now that it was gone, now that I had walked away and shut the door behind me, I was left standing in the stillness, forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that I had no idea who I was without it. And yet, in that silence, in the absence of their chaos, their demands, their endless crises I was expected to fix, something unexpected began to emerge, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of freedom, of possibility, of space to finally ask myself the questions I had spent years burying beneath spreadsheets and emergency meetings. Who am I when I'm not the fixer? Who am I when I'm no longer trying to earn their love, their approval, their permission to belong? The answers didn't come easily, didn't arrive wrapped in the neat packaging of a motivational poster or an Instagram quote. They came slowly, in the quiet moments of mundane routines, in the mornings spent drinking coffee without checking balance sheets, in the afternoons where I could choose to do nothing at all and not feel the crushing weight of guilt pressing down on my chest, reminding me that I wasn't doing enough. It was in those small, ordinary moments that I began to rediscover the parts of myself they had tried to erase. The parts that found joy in simplicity, in solitude, in building things not because they were expected of me, but because they brought me peace, fulfillment, meaning on my own terms. And while the scars they left behind still ached, still itched to reopen on bad days when the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry alone. I learned that healing wasn't about erasing the pain, it was about honoring it, acknowledging it, letting it be part of my story without letting it define the ending. Because the truth is, I didn't just lose a business. I lost an entire version of myself, the version they had written for me, the one who believed that love was something to be earned through sacrifice, that belonging was a prize doled out by people who thrived on withholding it. And as painful as that loss was, I came to see it not as a defeat, but as an invitation, an opening to rewrite my story, to build a life that wasn't constructed on proving my worth to people who never saw it, but on honoring my own boundaries, my own needs, my own quiet, steady voice. A voice that no longer needed to shout to be heard. A voice that finally belonged to me. Looking back now, from a distance I never thought I would allow myself to stand, I realized that what felt, in those moments, like losing everything was, in fact, gaining something far more valuable, gaining the clarity to understand that sometimes the bravest, most powerful thing you can do is to stay silent, to step back, to refuse to engage in the battles you were never meant to fight, and in doing so, to protect not just your finances or your reputation, but your soul. Because boundaries, those invisible lines we're told are selfish to draw, especially when it comes to family, aren't walls meant to keep people out, but fences built to protect what is sacred within us, to preserve the parts of ourselves that can so easily be trampled when we hand over control to people who see us only as tools, as pawns, as extensions of their own narratives. And while I can't tell you that setting those boundaries came without cost, can't promise that walking away from the family business, from the people I once built my life around, wasn't excruciating at times, I can tell you that the cost of staying, of continuing to shrink myself, of continuing to bleed for people who never offered a transfusion in return, would have been far greater. They called me the money guy. The one who didn't understand the real business, the one who wasn't cut out for the family legacy. But what they never saw, what they refused to see, was that the numbers they mocked me for obsessing over were never just numbers to me. They were patterns, truths, the language of accountability. And in the end, it was those numbers that set me free, those numbers that gave me the leverage to walk away with my head held high. Knowing that while they had tried to erase me from the picture, they could never erase the truth of what I had contributed, of what I had endured. And maybe that's the lesson I hope someone watching this will take away, not that revenge is sweet, or that walking away is always the answer, but that when you find yourself fighting tooth and nail to be seen, to be heard, to be valued in spaces that only ever diminish you, maybe the most radical, powerful thing you can do is to stop fighting, to stand still, to draw your line in the sand and say, no more. Because you can't change people who refuse to see the damage they cause. But you can change how much of yourself you're willing to lose trying. So let me ask you this, as you sit here, as you listen to my story, would you have stayed silent? Would you have walked away? Or would you have kept fighting, believing, hoping for something that was never really yours to begin with? Whatever your answer is, I hope my story gives you permission to choose yourself, to protect your peace, to understand that sometimes the loudest statement you can make is to say nothing at all, and to let the silence speak for you. Because in the end, it's not about the business. It's about knowing your worth. And never letting anyone, family or not, convince you otherwise.